Thank you for joining us here tonight. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to thank Gary Amanoff, President of San Fernando Valley Republican Club, for once again collaborating with children of Jewish Holocaust survivors on this event. I would like to offer a special thanks to Mark Tapson for the terrific interview he did with our guest, which was posted yesterday on David Horowitz's Front Page magazine. The editor of this important online magazine, Jane Glassoff, is present in the audience today, and I know that many of you are already familiar with his work as well. Mark Tapson wrote a fantastic introduction as part of his interview with our speaker tonight, and so since I am a far better reader than a writer, I will use Mark Tapson's words from his article. I do urge all of you to read the entire article. Dr. Mark Durie is a former linguistics scholar and now the vicar of St. Mary's Anglican Church, Caulfield in Melbourne, Australia. He writes and speaks extensively in Australia and internationally about Islam, interfaith dialogue, religious conflict, and the persecution of religious minorities, especially Christians living under Sharia law. Before it was innocuously named Park 51, the Ground Zero Mosque development had been known as their Cordoba House, which proponents claimed referred to a supposed golden age of multi-faith tolerance under Islamic rule. What they neglect to mention is that historically, non-Muslims under Muslim rule have been presented with three choices: conversion to Islam, death, or the subservient status known as Dhimmitude. Dr. Mark Durie's important new book sheds light on that little understood condition and its contemporary relevance. The third choice, Islam, Dhimmitude and Freedom. The book was released in February by Durer Books and shortlisted for Australian Christian Book of the Year. Dr. Durie will speak to us on this issue and other issues related to the threat of Islamic jihad and its relevance to us as people of the free world. Following his lecture, Dr. Durie will take questions from the audience. He will be happy to sign a copy of his book, The Third Choice, following the presentation. At this time, kindly turn off your cell phones, pagers, and other electronic gadgets, and please welcome with me Reverend Dr. Mark Durie.
Thank you so much, Doris, for that excellent introduction. It is such an honour and pleasure to be here tonight and to share with you some thoughts about a very important matter affecting us all. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, said that one thinks that one is tracing the outline of a thing's nature over and over again, and one is merely tracing around the frame through which we look at it. That's often the case with Islam. People think that they know Islam or are describing Islam, but really they're describing their own window that they're looking through out onto the subject. A good example of this recently was Rabbi Breton Grenator from New York, who in a 9/11 sermon said, among other things, that a mosque should be a place of peace, prayer and study. And I have no doubt at all that he came to that view because that is what a synagogue is, a place of peace, prayer and study. But in fact, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who was named in Foreign Policy magazine as the third in the list of the 12 most significant public intellectuals in the world today, and is a trustee of the Centre of Islamic Studies at Oxford University, in 2006, Yusuf al-Qaradawi issued a fatwa on the question of whether a mosque could be used for political purposes. And among other things, he said this: "In the life of the Prophet, there was no distinction between what the people call sacred and secular, or religion and politics. Politics for Muslims is part of our religion. From ancient times, the mosque has had a role in urging jihad for the sake of Allah. The Intifada," he said, "came from the minarets, and it was first known as the Mosque Revolution. The mosque's role in the Afghan jihad and in every Islamic jihad cannot be denied." Or as the current Prime Minister of Turkey in 1997 said, "The mosques are our barracks, the domes our helmets, the minarets are our bayonets, and the faithful are our army." It's a very interesting question you might ask after years of interfaith dialogue, how a highly intelligent and significant leader such as the rabbi from New York, could make a statement about a mosque that was so out of step with reality and what actual genuine Islamic thought understands the role of a mosque to be. But it is something that will happen again and again as you engage with Islam, that people have a lot of ideas about it and often fall wide of the mark. I'm going to be speaking tonight about two subjects, interrelated subjects. One is Islam itself, understanding Islam, and I'll run through the basic issues. And then going to look at Dhimmitude, the condition of those living under Islamic rule. In 2006, when Pope Benedict gave his now famous or perhaps infamous lecture in Regensburg, he quoted a Byzantine emperor, Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos, who spoke of Muhammad's command to spread by the sword the faith he preached. Now, these comments elicited a sharp reaction from Muslims all over the world, and people were killed even in the demonstrations that resulted. One of the most interesting responses was from Sheikh Abdulaziz al-Sheikh, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, which is really something like the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of a nation. So he's no fool and is highly trained. He issued a press release stating that Islam was not spread by violence. And his argument was the most interesting thing of all about his press release. He said it's false to say that Islam was spread by violence because the infidels had a third choice. The first option was Islam, the second was the sword, and the third was, as he put it, to surrender and pay tax, and they will be allowed to remain in their land observing their religion under the protection of Muslims. And the Grand Mufti referred his readers to Muhammad, to the example of Muhammad. He said, those who read the Quran and the Sunnah can understand the facts. So we will be speaking a bit tonight about the Quran and the Sunnah because that's where the facts are, he said. Now, according to another well-known expert on Islam, in fact an expert on Islamic terrorism you could say, the three choices are the reason for all Islamic terrorism in the world today. Why is there Islamic terrorism in the world? Well, according to that well-known expert on Islamic terrorism, Osama bin Laden, he said, our talks with the infidel West and our conflict with them ultimately revolve about one issue and one that demands our total support, with power and determination, with one voice, and it is this. Does Islam, or does it not, force people by the power of the sword to submit to its authority corporally, or if not corporally, then spiritually? The answer is yes. There are only three choices in Islam, either willing submission or payment of the jizya through physical but not spiritual submission to the authority of Islam, or the sword. For it is not right, he said, to let the infidel live. The matter is summed up: for every person alive, said Osama bin Laden, either submit or live under the suzerainty of Islam or die. So this bin Laden claims is the reason for the West's hostility, as he puts it, to Islam. The West, he said, avenges itself against Islam for giving infidels but three choices. And if he believes that's the reason, then it's well worth understanding what those three choices are. Well, to unpack these choices, I'm going to first speak about the Quran and the Sunnah, the facts, as the Grand Mufti said. I want to introduce a few F words to you. The first F word is falah, Arabic word which means success. It's a very, very important word in Islam. In the Islamic worldview, the problem with the world, with human beings in general, is that they lack guidance. And they're ignorant of what their master wants for them. The dominant model or image of the relationship between God and humanity in the Quran is that of a master-slave relationship. And the worst disaster would be to be a slave in Allah's house and not to have your instructions right. And the ignorance then is the fundamental human problem. That's basically the view of the Quran, is the fundamental human problem is ignorance. The solution is guidance from the master, and the result is success. That's probably the closest equivalent, or the most equivalent to what maybe the Christians would say is salvation. Salvation is not really, rescue is not really a major concept in Islam, it is rather success. In fact, the call to prayer that's issued from the minaret each day is come to success, come to success. That's how people are called to prayer every day. So in a nutshell, Islam says the problem is ignorance, the solution is guidance, and the result for the faithful Muslim will be success. The guidance is found in the example of Muhammad. The Shahada, or confession of faith in Islam, is a statement that there is only one God, no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. And it's the second part that really packs the punch. It explains the lot. Because the messenger is the one who brings the guidance. And the guidance of Allah comes through Muhammad. And it's in two forms. One is the Quran, and the other is Muhammad himself, his teaching and his example. That's what's known as the Sunnah. And it's a very interesting fact that a great deal of the practice of Islam cannot be based on the Quran, but in fact comes out of the example and the teaching of Muhammad. For example, it's widely known that in Islam there are 5 pillars, observance, such as declaring that there's no God but Allah, and giving alms, going on pilgrimage, fasting. But these 5 pillars are not actually listed anywhere in the Quran. They're found in the hadith, in traditions of Muhammad. And if you get a little booklet from a mosque explaining the 7 core beliefs of Islam, they'll give you a list of beliefs, belief in angels, in books and prophets and so on. But that list doesn't come from the Quran, it comes from the hadiths, from things that Muhammad did and said. The Sunnah, the example and the teaching of Muhammad, is the bedrock of Islam, which combines then with the Quran. You can't have one without the other. Sometimes compare Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah, the example and the teaching of Muhammad, as something like the backbone and the body of Islam. The backbone is the Quran and the body is Muhammad himself, the example and the teaching of his life. In fact, the Quran again and again says that you have to follow Muhammad's example. For example, chapter or Surah 24, verse 54 says, "Obey Allah and obey the Messenger. If you obey him, you'll go aright." And there are many other verses that say that. So for that reason, it's really difficult to have a Quran-only Islam. The Quran itself is a big signpost that says, look to the Messenger. Now, this raises a lot of deep problems, because Muhammad is a very interesting person, and the traditions of his life, it's a lot of material, many volumes that are used or relied upon to understand what the best example looks like. But some of the things that Muhammad did were admirable. He cared for orphans and cared for widows. Some of the things he did are really very surprising, and others are absolutely shocking, absolutely amazingly shocking things to do. And if he was doing these things in any modern state today, he would be in prison many times over. And that's a big problem, if his example is the best example. Another thing that's important about the life of Muhammad is that he is the benchmark or the standard by which the Quran is read. The Quran is organised from the longest chapters, apart from the first, to the shortest. And each chapter is itself not in chronological order, and the chapters are not ordered chronologically in the Quran. It's not in sequence. It's not written to be read as a narrative, much as you might say read Exodus or Genesis. It's a collection of materials not in any temporal sequence. But sequence is incredibly important for understanding it. Time sequence is important, and the time sequence is the life of Muhammad. One reason why the time sequence is important, although the Quran doesn't tell you that, is that of the principle of abrogation. The later verses cancel the earlier verses. Not later in the book, but later in time as when they were revealed. In fact, context is everything in interpreting the Quran, but the context is not so much the Quran itself, although that's important, but rather the position that the particular verse takes in the place in the life of Muhammad. The later verses cancel the earlier verses. This is quite an interesting idea, that Allah's last word is the one you follow, not the earlier things. He can change his mind, and like being a servant in the house or a worker in a business, you do the last thing your boss told you to do. So there are things that contradict in the Quran, and the way to find out which one applies is work out what was said later. For example, there's a verse in chapter 2 that says, "Forgive and overlook the unbelievers," until Allah brings another word. And Ibn Kathir, a very famous commentator on the Quran, his commentary's been translated into English, and it's available on tafsir.com. It's very easy to look up. It's an interesting book, interesting work. He says in his commentary on that verse, "Forgive and overlook the unbelievers," that it was abrogated by "kill the idolaters," which is 9:5, and also 9:29, "fight the people of the book." He He said Allah's pardon for disbelievers was repealed. It was abrogated by the verse of the sword, which is 9:5. The rest of the verse, which says, till Allah brings his command, gives further support for this view. The messenger of Allah and his companions used to forgive the disbelievers and the people of the book, just as Allah commanded, until Allah allowed fighting them, and then Allah destroyed those who he decreed to be killed. Ibn Kathir's commentary is the most widely used, or one of the most widely used commentaries that's been translated to English and very widely referred to by Muslims in the English-speaking world, and he's highly regarded. And this is a very typical view of interpreters of the Quran, that the later verses, if they contradict, cancel the early ones. And with regard to the issue of violence, that's very important because the later verses are the more aggressive ones, the more violent ones. So the point I'm making is that the life of Muhammad, not only does everything he said and did become very important in forming Islam, but the sequence of events in his lifetime also is the yardstick for interpreting the Quran. You read the Quran through the spectacles of Muhammad and his life. You can learn about Muhammad by reading the hadiths, which are collections of traditions, individual sayings. They're organised normally according to jurisprudential purposes, so for legal purposes. You'll get a whole chapter of the things that Muhammad did and said about marriage, and a whole chapter of the things he said about good manners. But they're also, the life of Muhammad is also found in biographies known as sirah. So these two, hadiths and sirah, are the sources really for Islam. A lot of materials. Now, what the religion of Islam has done has taken these materials, the Quran and the life of Muhammad, the things he did and said, and systematised them and turned them into rules, principles to live by, a whole ideology, a framework. And this is known as Sharia, which means road in Islam, in Arabic. And remember that Islam offers guidance, and a very important image in Islam is the path, to be on the right path. So the name for the system of guidance is the path, the road to walk on. In fact, the prayer that every Muslim prays 17 times a day in their ritual prayers is, lead us on the right, on the straight path. So that's what Sharia is, and it includes everything. It doesn't just include law, as a state might make today. It includes manners and also ethics, every possible thing in Islam. You can't have Islam without Sharia. Let me give you an example. When I was in Indonesia doing fieldwork in Aceh, I would often get into trouble because I'd be on a motorbike and I'd see a pedestrian and I'd greet them on the... And what I had to learn was that the pedestrian greets the person on the motorbike first. It's just a rule. And it was only years later when I read a hadith, the tradition of Muhammad, and it said this. Abu Hurairah reported Allah's messenger, may peace be upon him, as saying, the rider should greet the pedestrian. No, I'd be walking and they'd be on the bike, sorry, and I would greet them as I was walking and they'd be embarrassed. The rider should greet the pedestrian first, and the pedestrian, the one who's seated, in a small group should meet a large group. So that's a rule about when you're on a horseback, the person on the horse greets the person who's walking first. And it's a simple rule of politeness. That is Sharia as well. Sharia is also how you respond when someone sneezes. Abu Hurairah also said that Muhammad said, Allah likes sneezing and dislikes yawning. So if someone sneezes and then praises Allah, then it's obligatory on every Muslim who hears him to say, may Allah be merciful to you. But as for yawning, it's from Satan, so one may try one's best to stop it. For if one yawns and opens her mouth, then Satan will laugh at him. So if a Muslim mother trains their child to cover their mouth when they're yawning, they're not just following a cultural practice, they're doing it's a pious act. But Sharia law is not only about culture and politeness and rules of basic interaction, it also is about serious matters of law, such as the death penalty. Time magazine on June the 17th, 2002 carried this report. An Islamic court in Nigeria has ordered that Amina Lawal, who bore a child more than 9 months after her divorce, not be executed by stoning until 2003, when her baby is weaned. There was a huge amount of commentary about Amina Lawal and why this was happening. What had happened was that Nigeria had given Sharia law as a gift to the northern states, to some states that were predominantly Islamic. That was welcomed, and one of the consequences of that was this ruling. And many people said, oh, this has nothing to do with Islam, it's a terrible thing to happen. But in fact, if you know where to look, and you look in the example and the teaching of Muhammad, you'll find this tradition about something that Muhammad did. There came to Muhammad a woman from Ghamid and said to him, Allah's messenger, I've committed adultery, so purify me. She wants atonement. Muhammad turned her away. On the following day she said, Allah's messenger, why did you turn me away? By Allah, I have become pregnant. He said, well, if you insist upon it, go away until you give birth. When she was delivered, she came with the child wrapped in a rag and said, here is the child who I've given birth to. He said, go away and suckle him until you wean him. When she'd weaned him, she came to him with the child, who was holding a piece of bread in his hand, and she said, Allah's apostle, here he is, I've weaned him and he eats food. And then Muhammad entrusted the child to one of the Muslims and pronounced punishment. She was put in a ditch up to her chest, and he commanded the people, and they stoned her. Now, what's very interesting is that those judges in Nigeria were applying the example of Muhammad in waiting until the baby was weaned and in passing that ruling. It's part of Islamic law. Why? Because Muhammad did it and said it. So that's the basis for Islam. Islamic law is like a system of laws based on particular cases, and the cases are what Muhammad did and said. Another very interesting aspect of Islam concerning ethics has to do with telling the truth. And I'll do a bit of an excursus here and speak a bit about this aspect of Islamic teaching before I pick up my main theme. Taqiyya is a word which means a sort of guarding or protecting. And there's a verse in the Quran, chapter 3, verse 28, that says, let not the believers take for friends or helpers unbelievers rather than believers. That is, you should make friends with Muslims. If you do that, that is, make friends with unbelievers, the word actually not so much friends as more guardians or people that protect you, then you won't have any help from Allah, except by way of precaution that you may guard yourselves from them. So the verse is saying you can make friends with non-Muslims in order to protect yourself. And the commentaries are quite clear on what this means. For example, Ibn Kathir, who I mentioned before, you can look this up yourself, he said, believers are allowed to show friendship to the disbelievers outwardly but never inwardly. Abu al-Darda said, we smile in the face of some people although our hearts curse them. He says, the commentator says, Al-Hassan, quotes Al-Hassan, the tukva, or taqiyya, is allowed until the day of resurrection. Another commentator, Al-Zamakhshari, said, the heart is comforted by enmity and hatefulness in the situation where you're required to make friends with non-Muslims. This is quite a disturbing subject, and there's a different ethical framework from one that we're used to. I was quite fascinated with this and couldn't really believe my eyes when I was first reading it, and I don't really want to be thought of as a bigot. And yet the facts are there, and what do you make of this? So I explored it further, and in a manual on Sharia law I found some further explanation by Al-Ghazali, a famous philosopher and theologian, Islamic theologian. He said this, lying is sometimes permissible for a given interest, scholars having established criteria defining what types of it are lawful. Speaking is a means to attain objectives. If a praiseworthy aim is attainable through both telling the truth and lying, it's unlawful to accomplish it through lying because there's no need for it. When it's possible to achieve such an aim by lying but not by telling the truth, it's permissible to lie if attaining the goal is permissible, and obligatory to lie if the goal is obligatory. One should compare the bad consequences entailed by lying to those entailed by telling the truth, and if the consequences of telling the truth are more damaging, one is entitled to lie. And there's various chapters that go on in this manual about lying, permissible lying, exaggeration, giving a misleading impression. Now this is a significant issue in Sharia law. That is, there are times that can come up in a court where you can defend yourself by saying I lied, but it was permissible or even obligatory lying in that circumstance. There's a number of specific contexts where lying is permitted in Islam, and they are all related to the life of Muhammad, to the lies that he either blessed or told himself. How do we incorporate this into our worldview, into our understanding of basic ethics? The point that I'm making, just to step back a bit, is that Islam is based on the life of Muhammad, his example and his teaching, and the Quran, and that the system of law, the Sharia law, is based upon those principles, and they include what we would regard as law of the state, such as punishment for crimes, but also good manners and issues of faith, but also daily ethics as well, that are very formative and affect how people look at the world and how they manage their life. It's better, by the way, in Islam to give a misleading impression than to tell a direct lie. So one example that a Sharia manual gave is if someone comes to you and they want to see someone who's in your house, like, I'd like to see Fred, you can say, Fred is not here, meaning he's not here. And you haven't told a lie, you've given a misleading impression. So it's better to do that because you fear Allah, and actually lying is a terrible sin in Islam. And so if you give a misleading impression, you're protecting yourself, just in case this isn't one of those circumstances where lying would be the right thing to do. So normally, in my experience of observing Muslims who might believe this, that the misleading impression is the way to go. I want to also say, having said this, that Muslims are incredibly varied. Some Muslims have little faith. Others have more understanding of issues. Some might disagree with this. I've had discussions with Muslims who absolutely repudiate this idea that lying is acceptable. And they just think it's a terrible thing to say about Muslims or about Islam. So be aware of that. There's a lot of variation in what people think or do, but the doctrine is there. And not only there, but it's explained in quite great detail about how to apply it and when not to apply it. And a very well-trained person in Sharia law would have a good understanding of these issues because your eternal destiny is at stake. You want to please Allah and do the right thing, so you need to know when it's appropriate to tell the truth and when it isn't. But apparently one of them could be if you're in a minority position and you're relying on those around you to be your guardians, as that verse just said to you before, to protect you. And if you're in that position, then you may well develop what seem to be good friendships with those around you because they're in a powerful position. Anyway, that's what the Quran says and what the commentators have explained it to mean. So Sharia is a very big concept. It includes the scarves and the food, rules to what to do when you're sneezing and what to do with adulterers, basic ethics. It has rules for business, for warfare, for politics, for sexual relations, what to do when people die, everything. It's all based on the example and the teaching of Muhammad. The answer to most questions about Islam is Muhammad. He's usually the answer, one way or the other. Now, one thing that's really important about Sharia is that it presumes an Islamic society. Because it's an all-encompassing system, it assumes that these principles will be adhered to and supported and enforced by the state. Now, one way of putting this is that a radical Muslim, might believe that they will have no religious freedom until Sharia law is the law of the land. I'll say that again. Some radical Muslims believe they will never be free until Sharia law is applied in the country. They're always, in a sense, not free to follow their religion until the state enforces it. And that's a big challenge, I've looked at this issue in some detail. The organisation of the Islamic Conference, which is like the United Nations of the UN, has a fiqh academy, which is an academy that gives fatwas on lots of issues. Is it legitimate to inoculate people? And how do you respond to many of the current issues in the world today? And they published on one of their websites a few years back a collection of fatwas on the question of whether it's permissible for a Muslim to live as a citizen in a democratic country, a non-Muslim country. Very complicated arguments, and hedged around with lots of conditions. So these are issues that are being discussed and ruled upon at the highest level in the Islamic world. These are not just fringe issues, they're deep issues that affect Muslims. How do I function in society that's not an Islamic society? Now, what I'd like to move on is speak about the implications of Sharia, the path to please Allah, for non-Muslims who are living in an Islamic order. Those that have taken the third choice to live under these conditions that ultimately are derived, at least in the minds of the believers, from the example and the teaching of Muhammad. What does it mean to live as a conquered person under Islam? Well, the conditions of the conquered people are determined by the Quran and by the example of Muhammad. And some of these conditions or these beliefs are, for example, in chapter 3, verse 110, that Allah speaks to the Muslims and he said, "You're the best community that's been raised up for mankind. You command right conduct and forbid indecency, and you believe in Allah." So that's a statement that Muslims have a divine destiny to determine what's right and wrong for others. And that verse is often used to encourage Muslims to be proactive, engaged in the political process. Another belief that's in the Quran is that it is the destiny of Islam to rule over all other religions. He it is who sent his messenger, that is, Allah has sent his messenger, Muhammad, with the guidance, remember guidance, that's the answer to the ignorance, and the religion of truth, that's Islam, that he may cause it, the religion of truth, to triumph over all religion. So the purpose of Muhammad coming was to cause Islam to triumph over all religion. So that's part of the success that you're called to in the call to prayer. That's chapter 48, verse 28. Dominance in this world. This is a mainstream Orthodox Islamic theological perspective. Not all Muslims hold it. Obviously it's controversial in the world today. There's a lot of diversity among Muslims, but these are fairly traditional perspectives. But back to the three choices. The doctrine of the three choices goes back to Muhammad. He taught this, he said this: fight in the name of Allah and in the way of Allah, fight against those who disbelieve in Allah, that is, who aren't Muslims. When you meet your enemies, invite them to the three courses of action. Invite them to accept Islam. If they respond to you, accept it from them and desist from fighting. So if they convert to Islam, leave them alone. If they refuse to accept Islam, demand from them the tribute. This is the third choice I'm calling it. It's coming second here. If they agree to pay, accept it from them and hold off your hands. And if they refuse to pay the tax and surrender, seek Allah's help and fight them. So they're the three choices from Muhammad. The order may vary in different sources, but they're the three. Now, the question of whether Islam has been or should be spread by force is a big issue, one of the most contested ideological issues today, for lots of reasons. If the Grand Mufti is correct, and the key plank in the defence against the claim that it was spread by the sword is the third option of surrender, accepting life under Sharia rule, then it's a matter of great interest what this third choice means. What does it mean to live under those circumstances? What does it mean to make the third choice? And my book is devoted to two things. Firstly, to explaining Islam from the ground up so you can understand where everything fits. But the second is to understand what it means to have made that choice. Islamic tradition calls non-Muslims living under the political dominance of Muslims the dhimmis. It comes from a word dhimma, which means a pact of liability. The pact of surrender is called the dhimma. And the conditions which Sharia law induces in the dhimmis has come to be known and called by scholars, Western scholars, as dhimmitude. The stories of the dhimmis and dhimmitude is, I believe, one of the most pressing human rights issues, political, social, spiritual issues in the world today. I'm speaking about the situation of Christians in Afghanistan or Baha'is in Egypt, of non-Muslims living in Islamic circumstances. But one of the problems in engaging with this issue, as I explain in the book and the reasons for it, is that despite the urgency of the question, the treatment of non-Muslims under Islamic rule is a subject which is steeped in silence and denial very deeply. Now, at the heart of the book, the third choice is an analysis of the pact of surrender, because that's where the law is established, the basis of the relationship is established. The covenant of surrender, which in Sharia law is the covenant or the set of conditions under which non-Muslims are considered to be living in an Islamic society. And to one degree or another, this covenant still continues to deeply impact upon the lived situation of non-Muslims in Islamic states today. In Islamic law, the Dhimma Pact of Surrender treats non-Muslims as peoples whose lives would have been forfeit if the Muslims had not spared them. This is such a strange idea to our consciousness today, but it goes back to a pre-Islamic idea that if you conquered someone and let them live, they owed you a debt. They owed you their head. They also owed you their property, because you would have been able to take it. They would have been able to take it if they'd taken your life. Your women and your children would have been theirs as slaves. So if you're allowed to live, you owe them everything. It's a big debt you owe them. And the system of surrender involves a payment of reparations or tribute for that debt. The annual jizya head tax paid by the dhimmis, by every adult male, to the Islamic State is described in authoritative Islamic sources and commentaries as a redemption paid by the dhimmi in return for their life. Muslim lexicographers define the jizya tax, which is the annual head tax, as this: the tax that's taken from the free non-Muslims of a Muslim government whereby they ratify the compact, that's the Dhimma Pact, that ensures them protection as though it were a compensation for their not being slain. At-Faish, a 19th century Algerian commentator, explained this principle in his commentary on chapter 9 verse 29 in the Quran, which lays out the command to fight against the people of the book until they surrender and pay the tax. He says, it was said that jizya is a satisfaction for their blood. It is said that it has sufficed to compensate for their not being slain. Its purpose is to substitute for the duties. The word that's used in Arabic is wajib, which means a compulsory obligation upon Muslim believers. The duties of killing and of slavery. It is for the benefit of Muslims. Or as William Eaton explained in 1799 in his compendious survey of the Turkish Empire, he said the very words of the formulary given to the Christian subjects on their paying the capitation tax, the jizya, import that the sum of money received is taken as compensation for being permitted to wear their heads that year. In researching the book, I uncovered and studied in detail the powerful symbolism of the tax payment ritual, the jizya payment, which dhimmi males, or men, were required to pay, and they underwent all over the Muslim world until modern times. The payment ritual involved a blow on the neck, sometimes two blows on the back or the side of the neck, and in some versions a form of ritual strangulation, being led with a rope around the neck, signifying that the dhimmi is paying for his very life and rescuing his head by the tax. So you go through a ritual decapitation as you pay the tax. I was able to find around 30 references to this ritual from Morocco to Bukhara, from the 9th to the 20th centuries, from Muslim and non-Muslim sources alike, very widespread, Jewish, Christian and Muslim sources. Imagine if the Normans, after having conquered England in 1066, introduced a system whereby all the Anglo-Saxons had to line up on every village green and pay a tax, and as they paid it they would be ritually stabbed in the heart to show that they were winning their lives through that. And imagine that this is still happening in England today, and it's going to go on for another 4 centuries until it stops. And it'll only stop when England gets invaded by some other country and the rule of the Normans is finally relaxed. That is the time depth that this system applied in Morocco, in Damascus or Baghdad. It continued for the Jews of Afghanistan until the 1950s. It stopped in many countries because of European colonisation or occupation by European powers. Sometimes by pressure, the Ottomans relaxed the system under pressure from the European powers who were helping the Ottomans against the Russians in their jihad in the Crimea. Now, this dhimmi system was designed to reduce the Christians and the Jewish communities. The Jews, for example, of Morocco were under this system and went through this ritual for more than 1,000 years. In fact, there are numerous testimonies to the ritual being applied in Morocco to the Jews of Morocco, just one example. It's designed to reduce the Christian and the Jewish and the Hindu and the other communities. The 18th century Moroccan commentator Ibn Ajiba describes the purpose of the ritual in a passage which is unearthed and translated and presented for the first time in the third choice. He said it's intended to be a killing of the soul. The dhimmi is commanded to put his soul, good fortune and desires to death. Above all, he should kill the love of life, leadership and honour. The dhimmi is to invert the longings of his soul. He is to load it down more heavily than it can bear until it's completely submissive. Thereafter nothing will be unbearable for him. He will be indifferent to subjugation or might. Poverty and wealth will be the same to him. Praise and insult will be the same. Preventing and yielding will be the same. Lost and found will be the same. Then when all things are the same, the soul will be submissive and will yield willingly what it should give, particularly the redemption payment and other forms of submission. Al-Alusi, a 19th century Iraqi commentator on the Quran, writes of plundering the soul of the dhimmis. He said, but we know that enslaving them is permitted. Whoever may be enslaved can also be subject to jizya, because both slavery and jizya, the tax, involve plundering. his soul. The case of slavery is clear because we benefit from slaves. In the case of the jizya, this is produced by the infidel from what he earns, and he lives on what he earns. So when he surrenders his earnings to Muslims, which is his reason for being allowed to live, this is ruled to be equivalent to taking away his soul. In 1854, an Iraqi commentator. In essence, non-Muslims are regarded in classical Islamic law as people who owe their lives to the Muslim conquerors. They are expected to adopt an attitude of gratitude and humble inferiority. Indeed, the commentators are quite explicit on this issue. They speak about gratitude and a sense of inferiority as psychological conditions that the conquered peoples are meant to manifest. Many Sharia regulations were designed to impose this inferiority and make it quite explicit. For example, the witness of dhimmis is not accepted against a Muslim in an Islamic court. This makes them very vulnerable to violence and all sorts of abuse. They had to have lower houses and not riding horses. If ever you visit the Jewish quarters in parts of Spain that were built under the Muslim occupation, you'll observe they're very, very small houses. They were not allowed to have any means of self-defence, vulnerable to abuse. Now, these are ideas that were embedded in Sharia law but still affect culture today. So Iraqi Christians have suffered enormously under the occupation in the last decade. But one of their problems is being attacked by both sides. But if they have guards, they really have to employ Muslims, because it would anger the Muslims if Christians had weapons, because it's a principle of Sharia law that non-Muslims, and these are dhimmis in Iraq, are not meant to be able to defend themselves. No visible displays of their religion, so no crosses, no bells ringing. After Hamas took control in Gaza, the bells of the Catholic Church fell silent. If you look at photographs of Jerusalem in the 19th century, those early photographs, you'll see that none of the churches have crosses on the top. They only came later. No criticism of Islam is permitted at all. Dhimmis have to dress differently and more poorly. In fact, the yellow patch was invented for Jews in medieval Islam, and not just for Jews but other groups as well. And sometimes the clothing regulations were quite explicit and bizarre, for example, requiring that dhimmis had to wear different coloured shoes. Because the common baths were widespread throughout the Mediterranean, hangover perhaps from Greek times, there were even rules that if a dhimmi went to a public bath, they had to wear a bell around their neck, or in the early centuries sometimes they had a lead seal around their neck after they paid the tax, so that even if they were naked, a Muslim could tell that they were someone who was to be held in an inferior position. And sometimes a hadith from Muhammad is cited to support this principle. Muhammad said, "I've been sent with a sword in my hand to command people to worship Allah and associate no partners with him. I command you to belittle and subjugate those who disobey me, for those who look alike are of the same." So if you look like a Muslim, you would be a Muslim. So you must make sure they look differently to Muslims. So you won't greet them or bless them in the streets. Now, this is all described in the commentators as being a legal expression of the principle, of, as the Quran says in chapter 9, verse 29, of being brought low or made small. Now, these twin expectations of gratitude and inferiority are increasingly shaping contemporary geopolitics. They're being revived in many countries that are part of the Sharia revival. Pakistan has moved from a country with a secular constitution to an increasingly Islamised one, and the condition of the non-Muslim minorities is getting worse during that time, but also it's affecting the behaviour of Western governments and leaders as well. A good example of a display, a very public display of gratitude, for example, would be President Obama's speech in which he spoke of civilization's debt to Islam. And now, you might say, well, that's a strange thing to say, but actually from the context of the system I've described, it's an entirely predictable thing. Because a non-Muslim is meant to display gratitude for being spared, really. But the problem is this idea of non-Muslim gratitude gets extended as a kind of discourse of gratitude that permeates lots and lots of areas of discussion. All of civilization is meant to feel indebted, really, to Islam. And there have been many amazing statements by world leaders that really make sense in the light of this ideological frame. That is, although its foundations are hidden and not allowed to be discussed or brought into the light, it's nevertheless extremely powerful. It's a sort of system of worldview subversion or control. You have many leaders like Sarkozy, who said Islam is one of the greatest and most beautiful civilizations the world has known. It's a similar type of sense of gratitude and praise. It's a declaration of his own inferiority. One of the most striking statements was by Mary Robinson in 2002, former President of Ireland from a Catholic nation. She was speaking at the Human Rights Commission where she was president, or leader of that. She said, "It's important to recognise the greatness of Islam, its civilisations and its immense contribution to the richness of the human experience, not only through profound belief and theology, but also through the sciences, literature and art. No one can deny," I think she's saying be quiet if you think differently, "that at its core Islam is entirely consonant with the principle of fundamental human rights, including human dignity, tolerance, solidarity and equality. Numerous passages from the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad would testify to this. No one can deny from a historical perspective the revolutionary force that is Islam, which bestowed rights upon women and children long before similar recognition was afforded in other civilisations, and no one can deny the acceptance of the universality of human rights by Islamic states." I could give you many other examples of these displays of gratitude. In this case, she's saying that the rights of women, and she's a woman, really we owe this debt to Islam for bringing them into the world before the rest of the world knew about the rights of women. So that's a display of her own inferiority and her gratitude both at the same time. Her speech, I believe, was drafted by an advisor who was a Muslim on her staff. And what happens in that circumstance is that the worldview permeates the discourse and shapes the discourse. I could give you many other examples, but I'd like to speak about a man called David Khalili. I could give you many examples of Christians, but he happens to be a Jew of Iranian background. There was an art exhibition in Sydney of Islamic art, and the owner of the collection, David Khalili, is a Jew of Iranian extraction. And his first years in his life was spent in Iran. He's now extremely wealthy, very successful, and he devotes his life to promoting positive regard for Islamic art and positive relationships between religions, particularly in the West. And it's a very interesting phenomenon because the Persian treatment of Jews was particularly tough and cruel. The Shiites had a doctrine of purity in addition to the general ones which Sunni had that was more exaggerated and that made it even harder for Iranian Jews than there would be in other areas, you might say. But one of the most interesting things about David Khalili, and I heard him in an interview, were his statements that he made about Islam and Muslims. For example, he was asked whether his work to present Islamic art might help Muslims to understand that Jews are not inferior. And he said, "I don't think there is a question of the Jews being inferior. I don't think that has ever crossed any Muslim's mind." And then he said, "Virtually 1/3 of the Quran, the Surah Al-Baqarah, is in praise of the two other religions, Judaism and Christianity. I don't think that's a question at all. I think the problem is ignorance amongst people, and I can say on your program that I believe the biggest and the real weapon of mass destruction is ignorance. If people try to understand their culture, their religion, their way of life, and then they started to respect each other." He appeals to this idea that's very common in the West, that if only you understand the other, you will love them. And ignorance is the cause of bigotry and hatred. It's the To Kill a Mockingbird theory, where every ill feeling you might have to someone else is because you don't understand. So he appeals to that. He taps into a deep source of feeling in the West, and he says ignorance is the problem. But what's very striking about his statement is his own contributions to ignorance. For example, chapter 2 is not 1/3 of the Quran, as he says, but about 7%. Well, that's not very important, perhaps. But far from being in praise of Christianity and Judaism, it largely consists of a long litany of retorts that Muhammad gave to the Jews in Medina as a kind of prologue to his expulsion of them and the genocidal attack on the last remaining tribe, the Bani Qurayza in Medina. Included in chapter 2, which he cites, is a verse that says that Allah changed Jews into apes, and one that alleges that Jews forged their scriptures. And there are many, many anti-Jewish libels in this chapter, which he says is in praise of Judaism. Has he ever read it? I don't know. It must be admitted there was one verse that I found that does speak positively about Jews in chapter 2, the largest chapter in the Quran. Now, such events that I've collected a lot of over the years raise very troubling questions. Khalili is an intelligent person. He has every advantage of culture and background to be familiar with the materials that he's speaking about so inaccurately. Why would someone do that? Why would he devote millions of dollars to doing that? I'm familiar with, from pastoral ministry, of the denial of the abused person, the battered woman, who praises her abuser despite all his cruelty to her. The idea that victims praise their oppressors is hardly a new one, and no one can live without hope. An abused person characteristically needs to shift blame to other parties or even to themselves in the effort to make life bearable and not completely hopeless. Survivors of abuse must blame themselves because it's given them hope and a belief that they can have some control over the situation. If it's my fault, then I can somehow moderate my behaviour. They defend and identify with their abuser even as the abuse continues. I've seen that terror on the face of a number of abused women. They honestly believe their husband's aggression is everyone else's fault but his. And the terror and shock comes at the point when they realise that the husband is the problem and nothing and nobody else can justify that behaviour. This is, for some, a point of the sheer terror, the very worst moment in their recovery. The point of realisation that victims are schooled to avoid at all costs. The denial and the gratitude, the expressions of inferiority, this discourse of inferiority help protect the victim and build a cocoon to protect them from this point of realisation. I recently read a statement by a group of Christians in the Middle East who were protesting against Israel's occupation, and they were hoping to live in a multi-religious secular state encompassing what is now Palestine and the Palestinian territories and Israel. I found it a very sad document. They are a captive people, schooled by a century of genocide that they've seen happening all around them with the Armenians and the Assyrians and others, and rising Islamist violence to the point where they are imprisoned in their worldviews. They were just like the abused woman. So the third choice is also concerned with the wounds to the souls of non-Muslims, and indeed of Muslims too, caused by this abuse. I devote a chapter to looking at the persecution of Christians in Muslim nations and arguing that today in every single particular where non-Muslim minorities are not treated equally or fairly in Muslim countries, it is because of the principles in Sharia law which all derive from the foundation that I've described. There is a very deep resistance in Western cultures today to take theology seriously, religious ideology. By and large, we've forgotten how to apply theological constructs to everyday life. And there's also a great fear of being intolerant. I don't want to sound like a bigot. I've spoken on the Taqiyya issue, deception issue, many times, but every time there's a sense inside me, it's like, how can I say these things? How can you say this about somebody else? But really, we can't afford to lull ourselves to sleep by assuming that all religions are essentially the same. Are all political ideologies the same? Do they produce the same kinds of societies? Is North Korea the same society as South Korea, even though their ideologies are different? Why would religious ideologies be impotent to influence people's destinies and nations? It's a crazy thought that religion doesn't matter, or that religion is not the cause of anything. I spoke to an advisor of a politician in Washington about a year ago, and he said, well, really, when people fight wars, it's never because of religion, it's because of women or money or land or something. What did they say? Religion is the opiate of the masses. It's an excuse. It's a tool to manipulate people for other reasons, economic reasons. So the marginalisation of faith as a significant issue in determining world affairs is one of the kind of weaknesses, the ideological damages that we've suffered in this century. We can't really accept that. We mustn't. Theological illiteracy is no solution to the problems caused by religious intolerance and hatred. We need the ability to think critically about faith, to understand, analyse, appreciate its distinctive and unique contributions, sometimes for good, sometimes not for good. For this reason, one of the arguments that I'm making in the third choice is that faith matters. What you believe matters. It needs to be understood and interacted with on what it really is in order to understand the world today. I found this book really difficult to write. It was a long time in gestation, because it speaks of the most profound and deeply affecting themes of personal identity and spiritual history, and also impacts on geopolitics and the future destiny of nations today. Please don't be like many that I've spoken to over the years. And when you speak about these issues, will not listen until you give them the solution. Tell me what the answer is and then I'll listen to the problem. I mean, how can you ever solve a serious problem that way? The problem is much bigger than that. You need to sit with the problem and answers will come. They will come. But they won't just come as easily as that. And anyway, if you don't know the problem, you won't believe the answers. You won't even understand why they're necessary. They won't seem credible. This is a kind of disease in the West, a laziness of the mind, which refuses to process information it cannot solve. Our first challenge is to understand the problem, the challenge. I believe that if we do that while retaining human compassion and dignity and respect for people, solutions will come. They won't be easy, they'll be costly. There'll be changes to the way we live and think, but they will come. So I commend my book to you and I look forward to your questions very eagerly. I'm very interested to interact. I welcome hostile questions as well, but please don't preach to me. It's the question that I'm interested in, not the declaration. I hope that my desire is to change people's minds and to do some surgery on your worldview. And a lot of people are hovering in a situation today where they realise things are happening, they can't make sense of it all, and they need to rethink things because they want a way through. And if you're willing to be assisted, that's what I'm trying to do, to give you some resources for reconstructing the way you think about people, about faith and about the world, and giving you a way forward that's not driven by rejection or hatred or bigotry, but is well-informed, compassionate, but unafraid to face some very difficult truths in this time. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Cultural beliefs,
yes,
but have the same political beliefs. So something you said suggests otherwise of that basically your overall ideology will push you towards overall belief in life, and a political belief, and social beliefs, and religious beliefs. So you can't. So your faith matters, your overall worldview matters for ultimately how you believe in politics. So someone who believes in kind of social or cultural things will ultimately believe in social political things. What do you think how would you respond to those lines? Would you say it doesn't matter? Culture, you can have different cultures and the same politics, or does it matter?
What's the relationship between variety of cultural beliefs and religious beliefs and political beliefs? Can they be separate or independent? Are they interrelated? It does depend on the nature of those beliefs. So some religious beliefs allow quite a range of cultural practices, for example. You can worship in many different languages in some religions. Others require everyone to worship or to say their prayers in Arabic. So it depends on the nature of the religion. I don't think there's a single answer to that. With regard to the role of variation that exists within the practice of a particular religion, I sometimes think of the foundations of a faith, like the foundations of Islam and the actual practice of Muslims as something like the ship and a compass. You know, a ship's on the seas, that's the person, and they have their beliefs and they're going in different directions. But every now and again someone says, hey, let's look at the maps and the compass. And they do, and they say, oh, we should go that way. And it doesn't have to be a very big change, but over centuries you can keep doing this and gradually move people back towards this source that informs people. So it's not a one-on-one relationship between what the Quran, the Sunnah and the Hadiths teach and how people believe and act. But over a long period of time you can get this constant process of recorrecting and bringing back to that model. And that's the way. When you have a reformation of Islam or Islamic revolution, you kind of keep coming back to those foundations. They keep on being brought up. And I had a very interesting time coming over speaking to a taxi driver who's from Pakistan. He's a Muslim, not very observant. This is in Australia. Not particularly observant, but a Muslim, you know. And I said, what do you think about Sharia? He said, I'm a Muslim. I have to accept it. I think it's good. He says, good. I said, what about Sharia law being introduced in Pakistan? He said, it's a good thing. I said, well, what about what the Taliban does? He said, oh, they're ignorant people. They don't really know what real Sharia is like. So he has this deep conviction that it's a good thing, even though he perhaps doesn't know himself all what it would entail for him or for Christian or non-Muslim Pakistanis.
About your mentioning of the film To Kill a Mockingbird and also the attempted censorship of people who who speak on topics as you do. I was wondering if you heard about Attorney General Holder's speech today at the University of Alabama. Is that why you brought up those two examples? Because in speaking there today, he said that Muslims in the U.S. today, because of people who are opposed to the mosque in New York, are suffering under repression and a climate of ignorance and hatred that you can only see by watching the movie To Kill a Mockingbird. And I was wondering if you were referring to that.
Are Muslims suffering from a climate of ignorance and repression, as, for example, in To Kill a Mockingbird? I think I didn't hear that speech, but I've been struggling with this idea for a very long time, that ignorance is the cause of the problem. And it's often said by people who themselves are absolutely ignorant. I realised, as I thought about it more and more, that this value had been deeply instilled in generations of students. And Kill a Mockingbird is selling thousands and thousands all the time, as it's a compulsory text in every high school. And it's become so deeply embedded that we can no longer ask why we believe this, that ignorance breeds hatred, and that ignorance is the solution to every kind of conflict. Sometimes if you actually get to know someone really well, it doesn't increase your love for them, but it makes you feel that you're not so keen to get in bed with them. From this lady here, thank you.
Is there any way our country can protect ourselves? I have two things in my mind. Any way our country can protect ourselves from dangers within and without being called whatever, racist and all that. And the other thing I just want to throw out, please, when they keep saying that Muslims are just like other Americans, I've had this concern for years. Other American groups are concerned with all Americans, and they build hospitals. There are Catholic hospitals, Presbyterian hospitals, Methodist, Jewish. Where is a Muslim hospital for other Americans?
I think it is true that the tradition in Islam is that social care is for Muslims only. And Muslims will sometimes help others, but it's part of a mission, part of an outreach or presentation of Islam. I think there are millions of things you can do in America. It won't stop you being called a bigot, but you really need to get a bit of a thick skin about that. First of all, you need to be strong about what you believe and understand why you're not going to accept that label. But there are lots and lots of things. You need to elect the right politicians. You need to demand your right to speak freely. You need to pay attention. I'd say there's a gap, there's a yawning gap developing between the elites and ordinary people. You sit in the armed forces. I think lots of people in the military, lots of ordinary soldiers, are not happy about Islam, but at the highest level, there's this culture of denial and silencing. And you need to pay attention. Who's advising who? Who's being appointed to which positions? You need to be active in your schools and insist that the textbooks that are promoting an Islamised version of history, Islamisation of knowledge is a good phrase to describe what's happening, not be accepted. You need to write, you need to blog, you need to just speak your mind. The more heads above the parapets, the better, you know, the more people that are speaking out. There have been some really good things happening in Australia. Lots of people have been speaking up, and our newspapers describe jihadis as Islamic jihadis, you know. It's no problem. It wouldn't have happened 6 years ago, but we've reached a point now where it's quite possible to speak about faith as a reason or a factor in their radicalisation. You're not in that place in the US because there's been a kind of ideological clampdown that's been happening in recent years from the highest levels, and you really need to rise up and do something about it in every way possible. Could we have this lady here in the scarf? Thank you.
I was asking about Sarkozy.
Yeah.
Why haven't made a positive reference to Islam when recently he has just banned the burqa and
yes.
a different attitude? Would you comment on that? And the other question was regarding the interest in Sharia. Someone told me that you could charge interest, but it went to charity. Do you know anything about that?
Look, I've been in Indonesia and they charge interest and it went to the bank or to the investor, so it's I think that might be something that's said, but I've seen lots of cases where that's not the case. I think Sarkozy, well, you know, people say contradictory things, and he's under two pressures. One is this pressure to kind of praise Islam, especially when he's visiting Saudi Arabia. That's what your speechwriter puts in your speech for you. But the other pressure is that France, after years of denial, of not describing the riots and the things happening in the suburbs as being involving a particular religious group is sort of they're feeling quite nervous now, and they're trying to draw a line. So he politically has to be part of that process of drawing the line, and the French, when they're pushed, can be pretty tough. So I think you're going to see in Europe people who might earlier have wavered and not been particularly clear increasingly having to be strong, otherwise they'll lose their constituencies. The UK is worried because all the major parties have their heads in the sand on this issue, and there's going to be a lot of pressure for alternative parties to arise, as has happened in Holland. So fascinating times ahead politically for Europe. A question was there a question up over here from this lady in the middle?
I was wondering if you could elaborate more on women, because I've heard you touch on women originally in Islam law having more rights. I saw a video of a Muslim woman talking actually to like a school-funded field trip with a bunch of children talking about it too. And I as a woman, I hear about women not being allowed to pray or having to be praying back, wearing burqas, being stoned. So where does that argument come from?
The Dawah project to call people to Islam involves proclaiming the excellence of Islam. And one of there's an awareness that the role of women is an issue, so you counter that by declaring that Islam is wonderful for women. And the people that will do it will be the women who've converted themselves and live under Islam, or married a Muslim. So they've been taught that. And they use the evidence of, for example, the abuse of women in Western societies, prostitution, pornography, the objectification of women's bodies. It's very easy to make the case that we abuse women in the West in a terrible way. Of course, the reality is that Muhammad's treatment of women and things he said about women were horrific. The Quran says that a husband can beat his wife. This has been upheld in a ruling recently, over a year ago, by the International Fiqh Academy of the Organisation of the Islamic Conference, which is the supreme Islamic kind of jurists body in the world. It speaks of the conjugal rights of the husband in a fatwa on domestic violence. Muhammad said that hell will be filled with women, that their religion and their intelligence are deficient. If a woman or a dog passes in front of a man who's praying, his prayers is nulled and he has to pray again. Muhammad himself took 2 Jewish women as concubines or slaves. He actually forced one of them to marry him. In one case, after they'd been taken to him past the tortured and dead body of her husband. In Islamic law, a woman who's captured can be used sexually by the captor, and it's declared that she's divorced by the act of capture, so it's not adultery for the Muslim to have sex with her if he takes her in war. This is what happens to although dhimmi women, if their community is considered to have broken the pact. The women become available, and in fact many dhimmi communities live in fear of women being taken. There's lots of evidence, testimony from Christian, Jewish and other communities of these sorts of things happening. I think Wafa Sultan's view on Islam is not inaccurate. I mean, it's a very personal story, but she said one of the big problems is, in her view, as someone who's an atheist, is that Allah hates women. And this sort of works its way through Islam. So it's very difficult to make broad statements like that because individual people's experience can be quite different, and no doubt there are Muslims who have wonderful marriages and they both love each other deeply. But in Australia, the Islamic communities had problems with wife abuse, and they've had to institute programs to try and teach Muslim men that it is not their religious right to use physical abuse. Another example is that in Islamic law, the man is a guardian of the wife, so he gives testimony on her behalf in the court. She can't necessarily, if he doesn't want her to, she can't easily speak for herself. It's very, very difficult. Also, there's a hadith, the tradition that says that Allah will not ask a man the reason why he beat his wife. And if Allah, on Judgment Day, if God will not ask a man why he beat his wife, then a court cannot ask a man why he did it either. So often in an Islamic court, the first question they'll be asked the woman is, what did you do to make him do this? So the problems are really profound. And this is not new information. You can read the hadiths for yourself. Female circumcision is a compulsory in Shafi'i law and recommended or allowed in other forms of law. And the result is that all the areas where Shafi'i law, one of the branches of Sunni Islam, applies, it's practiced in Indonesia, in Malaysia, amongst the Kurds who are Shafi'i Muslims, in Egypt, and not amongst the Arab Iraqis as much because they're not Shafi'i Muslims. So that goes back to Muhammad, who he said that when you circumcise a girl you shouldn't cut too deep. He defined sexual intercourse as taking place lawfully when the two circumcised parts touch each other, thereby legitimising the practice. I discuss in the book a number of debates on Arab television between Muslims about female circumcision, whether it's lawful or not, and the great difficulties they're facing, because for some Muslims it's abhorrent, for others it's part of the religion and they're struggling to come to terms with this. So that statement that Islam is rescuing women and has done so much for women, in my view, is just a complete, sales trick, really. And it's also, in a sense, an inevitable claim that's made by people who do convert to Islam, who believe that it's the best system in the world. It sort of derives out of your conviction that it has to be good. So you have to declare that. You've got no choice. Can we have another woman here, and then we'll move over to this side. Yes, please. Yes.
At the beginning of your talk, you said you wouldn't even mind a hostile question.
Yes, please.
But this is not a hostile question. From a different perspective.
Yes.
Someone who's worked in the Interfaith community for about 25 years.
Yes.
I had an opportunity to go to a Muslim women's convention 3 years ago in New York, sponsored by the Asma Society. And they brought 150 outstanding Muslim women from all over the world, highly educated, brilliant women doing a lot of social action work. And they had a lot of sessions about different subjects, and one of them was how women could help change Sharia from within. Wafa Sultan and Ali Hirsi and other people who have been very critical of Islam basically have thrown out Islam. And these women were trying to see how they could remain Muslims and still affect change. So I hear what you're saying about the Muslims around the world, and a lot of it is accurate. I'm not arguing with that. But I'm also seeing an enormous transformation, the revolution going on among the Muslim community and people who are really trying to change things. So my question to you is, and maybe the numbers aren't great enough, but how would we, rather than being just critics of Islam, how could we find
how
can we find a way to strengthen the people in the Muslim community who are trying to affect change?
It's important to let people speak, isn't it? Because it would be a great victory for Islam if we shut people up. I respect the fact that there are many Muslim reformers who are in Islam and believe in Islam. Raphael Israeli put it this way. She said, for most Muslims who are not happy with everything in Islam, they have in their hearts a longing for God, and they will not easily give that up. So they have no alternative, practically, but to stay with their religion, but to find a different way of doing it. And I think it's good to respect them and encourage them. There are Muslims that claim you can have a Quran-only Islam, although I find that very, very difficult to imagine how to do that, but they're fighting for that. These are courageous people. They're risking their lives to try and bring change, to speak out. Sometimes they'll say Sharia law as exists is not a true representation of what Muhammad taught, so they use that line. I don't believe that myself, but I want to support their right to say that. What's happening now today is that the Muslim world is in an incredible ferment of many different views and opinions. It's not monolithic. There are many Muslim atheists out there in the Middle East. There are many disbelievers. There are many that are leaving Islam for other faiths. There's a lot of change happening. It's a very dynamic time. And new information about Muhammad, the effect of the internet, this is having a transformative effect. We should encourage them. But encouraging them is not the same thing as saying that I buy into their claims, for example, that if only people followed Muhammad properly, women would be treated well. Another factor that's important is that sometimes Muslim women have been an important voice in stopping Islamisation. For example, in Toronto or in Canada, the state was willing to introduce Sharia courts for domestic issues, but it was Muslim women speaking against it that stopped it. Because they said, if you force Muslim women to have their cases adjudicated by Sharia law, you'll strip our human rights away. So they knew what it was. And they need to be empowered to speak up, and people need to support them, really. So my view is to encourage, not to discourage. Was there a question from over here somewhere? Or maybe up the top here?
Yeah. Perhaps the best way to handle this is maybe to be taking care of the problems within our society, and not just as well as those.
Okay, let me respond to that proposition. The best way to handle Islam is to deal with our own problems. Of course we should do our best we can, and if people are unhappy and disaffected, they do look for other things, that's true. But beware of this danger. And the danger is this, that to say there are other causes for the problems that Islam brings outside Islam. Those bombers were from impoverished countries, you know, or if only they hadn't been oppressed. It's our abuse of the Muslim world that causes terrorism. If only we change our policies, we'll be fine. If we fix out our own house, this problem will be dealt with. Beware of that, because that is the mentality of the abused person, of someone who's already defeated. A question down here. Fethullah Gulen is, the question is about Fethullah Gulen and why his school's expanding in America. Fethullah Gulen is a Turkish thinker and philosopher, and has a very large movement around the world amongst Turks and others. It's very influential into Central Asia, and in Australia, the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne appointed the Fethullah Gulen Chair of Islamic Studies, funded by this very wealthy. And he presents himself as a moderate and emphasises the Abrahamic shared identity, and is focusing on forming people through education. He's claimed in Turkey to be an Islamist, but in a velvet glove, you know, so that he's had some serious charges made against him. And I think I've already described why, some of the psychological reasons why people are not willing to accept the truth about radical Islam. And this is not just an issue that's affecting schools. Many of the university centres in the US are affected by these problems. And as I said, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's a sort of spiritual godfather of the Muslim Brotherhood, one of the most powerful influences for radical Islamisation, is a trustee of the Centre of Islamic Studies at Oxford University. And where does the funding come from? And why is he there? Well, it's obvious what he stands for and what his goals are. So this problem is not just in that movement, it's at many, many levels and needs to be addressed in many, many levels. This gentleman here, yes please, yeah.
Have you ever had an occasion where an imam or Islamist leader challenged you or had his position to discuss with you on stage anywhere?
I haven't.
And two, why is there not a fatwa against you?
Have I debated Muslims on stage, and why isn't there a fatwa against me? I haven't. I've chosen not to do that. I have lots of friends who have, and so it's a good thing to do. Until I published The Third Choice, I kind of, in some ways, kept my head down a bit. But having published the book, I'm more outspoken. Partly that I wanted to have in writing what I believe, so if I was challenged about an off-the-cuff remark or something that someone alleged I said, I'd have written down clearly an argument that had some depth behind it. I haven't had a fatwa against me. I'm not seeking one. And I hope that everything that I've said in the book is very clearly, very, very intensively documented and referenced many times to Islamic sources. And if anyone did challenge those things, I'd be only too glad to discuss the reasons why they're there. A question here.
Yes. Sharia law is obviously in conflict with Western values and Western law.
Yes.
Do you see the potential of any reformation in Islam or will we forever have a conflict between Islam and those who are not of that faith?
Yeah, the word reformation is an ambiguous term. In the Middle Ages it meant to go back to the sources. So St. Francis of Assisi was a reformer, and he did it by going back to Jesus' teaching, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Luther was an evil person in some ways, but he did some good things as well, and he claimed he spoke out about freedom, and he quoted Galatians, for freedom Christ has set us free. So people look to the source for their inspiration. But the problem with Islam is if you reform Islam, you go back, in that sense, you go back to the life of Muhammad and the teaching of Muhammad. One prominent Australian Muslim, Walid Ali, said that anyone who knows anything about Islam knows the Islamic Reformation has already happened and Al-Qaeda is the result. There's another sense of Reformation which is to improve by progress, changing society by influencing other ideas. Ataturk did that in Turkey. He banned the scarf. He actually suppressed many expressions of Islam. So that's not a reformation within Islam. It's actually it's a counterbalancing of Islam by other thoughts and other forces. That's possible. But speaking as a religious person who looks to the scriptures for my guidance and tries to build a worldview based on it, if you do that based on Islam, it's an incredibly difficult job to produce the kind of worldview that you would be hoping Muslims would produce. Because the texts are so clear on lots of disturbing points, and it's extremely hard to undo them. The other problem is you'd have to throw out 1,000 years of Islamic exegesis and commentary and all the great admired thinkers. It's this incredibly traumatic thing to redo Islam. It's not just that people have sort of lost the way and you can kind of clear the decks. It's much more serious than that. You need a grassroots response. You need lots of people to be informed. Wafa Sultan says, inform yourself about Islam. You really need to do that hard work. You do need leaders to stand up. There'll be times and seasons. The Dutch took quite a while to respond, but they're responding now. There is a network of people that are working on responding. You need strong leaders. You need the Pope to speak up. You need the Archbishop of Canterbury not to say that Sharia is not an alien system and it should be embraced. It's just a long process, a hard battle that has to be fought, and at many levels, and we've just begun. This is going to go on for a century or more. It's not going to be next year's battle. It's a very, very long one, and you need to have some energy and strength in the road. I'm going to stop there and hand over to Doris. Thank you so much.
And if there's any students here with an ID, they get a free one.